Your amygdala is actually designed to take over your muscles, your frontal lobe, your hormonal output, your entire nervous system. And you want that to happen in the face of immediate danger. The problem is that your amygdala can't differentiate between an immediate, extreme survival threat right here in this moment, saber-toothed tiger attacking you, and something that feels very stressful, a difficult work situation, a boss yelling at you, a fight with your partner, giving a public speech. So your amygdala, if it is like tuned to go, is going to react to all of those things with the same impulses that it will react to a survival threat. And the term for this is amygdala hijack. So, an amygdala hijack is an overwhelming response to a stressful situation, but the response is in excess of what's actually needed. So, the amygdala hijack happens when the stressor is causing it, but it is not actually a life threatening danger. It also happens when you are imagining a future life threatening danger because your amygdala can't differentiate between what's actually happening and what you're imagining. And it reacts the same to something that's very far in the future because it has no sense of time. So this video is going to help you learn how to manage these amygdala hijacks because they will happen. But the more you can be prepared for them, the more you understand yourself, and the more you practice certain tools and techniques prior to any amygdala hijack, the more able you will be able to calm that reaction, keep your frontal lobe online operating correctly, and it will help you begin to respond to stressful situations rather than react. So, just a couple more thoughts about the amygdala and the amygdala hijack, because these will relate to how you manage to begin to learn to manage it. But remember that the amygdala hijack can happen with a fight, flight, or freeze response. Also, keep in mind that the amygdala hijack doesn't actually shut down your frontal lobe, it co ops it. It brings the frontal lobe into service for that survival impulse. So your frontal lobe is sort of co opted. It keeps working, but it's not working the way you would want it to. I also want to say the amygdala hijack is not your emotions taking over, it's your reactivity. Our emotions can be a wonderful wealth of information. Our emotions help us make good decisions. They help us feel joy. They help us choose what we want, know what we want. So, this is not about those emotions being horrible and we need to be totally rational. This is about a reactivity that is based in your biology that is a survival response. And the last piece to keep in mind here, your amygdala is very closely linked with another part of the brain, which is your hippocampus. And your hippocampus is about memory and emotion. And the hippocampus focuses on emotional memories, in particular, intense emotional memories, and it makes associations between situations and the emotions you felt, and it links those very closely. And then it communicates with the amygdala if it recognizes any of those types of situations, those associations, those patterns. And this is really the key to learning how to deal with that amygdala hijack. It is the key to why you get hijacked, is really that conditioned response in your brain, in your hippocampus, emotional memory. So the first step in calming down that amygdala hijack, in increasing your emotional regulation and your ability to stay regulated, is to recognize the signs and symptoms of the hijack. Now, these can vary person to person, but generally it's an overwhelming rush of emotion and physical symptoms: anger, fear, panic, an intense, immediate emotional response to something. It can also be feeling totally overwhelmed, unable to cope. The physical symptoms of it can include a racing heart, shallow breathing, a feeling that you can't move your muscles, or feeling like you have to move your muscles. It can also sometimes be difficulty thinking clearly or speaking clearly, and it's an inability to focus on anything other than what you feel at that moment is a threat. So people who go into rages will talk about seeing red, just like all of a sudden, whoosh, they just see red. So what you want to do in recognizing these symptoms is that, and this is not the easiest, I understand, but when they happen, you want to pull in that observer brain and be like, okay, these are the symptoms of that fight, flight, freeze response, and do whatever you can to breathe more calmly and be more present. But both for myself and in working with people over 20 years as a therapist, it became obvious that as you begin to pay more and more attention to these symptoms, and the rest of these steps are going to contribute here, you'll be able to back up and you'll be able to see it before it gets totally overwhelming. So the earlier you can catch some of these symptoms, the better. Step 2, take a pause. The second you feel an overwhelming rush of emotion, take a deep breath, take a moment, take a pause. I used to run an agency and we had programs in the elementary schools for little kids, and we used the theme of stop, take 5, and think. Counting to 5, whatever tool you want to use, just to give yourself a pause, even a very brief pause, will help. Step 3 is to know your patterns. So, not just the symptoms of the amygdala hijack, but also the patterns that you have. What situations tend to cause anxiety? What situations tend to cause you to go into a rage or to freeze? Understanding your history so you can understand what's encoded in that hippocampus. What's encoded there that's triggering your amygdala to panic? When you understand the situations that tend to trigger you, you can start step number 4 earlier than otherwise. So, step number 4 is to engage your prefrontal cortex. So, let me tell you how those two relate, step 3 and step 4. So, if you know your patterns and you know that, say, giving a speech makes you panic, most likely what is happening now is that prior to a speech, your mind is going, oh no, it's coming. Your amygdala is already activated well before you have to get up on that stage and give that speech. So you're actually hijacked long before you're actually aware of it. This happens with panic attacks too. People will say they hit out of the blue, but once they do a bunch of work on it, they'll realize, let's say you have panic attacks in cars, even before you get in the car. You'll be like, oh no, am I going to have a panic attack? Am I not going to have a panic attack? You are already engaging that hippocampus and amygdala to begin that process of pumping out your stress chemicals. So if you know this, you can actually do the opposite, which is that, worrying about giving that speech ahead of time is not going to help. I'm actually going to do some of the regulatory techniques, some of the emotionally regulating techniques, sorry, to calm down prior to going. So instead of the, oh no, that's coming, I'm like, okay, well, I don't like giving speeches. I don't like seeing those people. I don't like being in the car. But right now, I'm none of those things, and I can remain regulated prior to that time. This will really, really help you. It may not sound like it's going to help you, but it really will help you because truly, your anxiety is already going like this by the anticipation of that future threat. Remember, your amygdala can't differentiate between a current threat and the future imagined threat. So let's make that step number 4. Engage your prefrontal cortex before you enter a situation that you know might be triggering. Step 5, grounding techniques. These are so helpful And practicing these regularly, not when you're in the middle of an amygdala hijack, not when you are like in the middle of a situation that's stressful. Practicing them regularly is what is eventually going to rewire and retrain your brain and help you stay more present. So grounding techniques can be things like stomping your feet, being aware of all your senses, paying attention to what you're hearing, what you're seeing, really being present, grounding into your body. And I have a video on grounding techniques. There are many other videos. Highly recommend them because the amygdala hijack, remember, is happening before rational thought. Your amygdala moves so fast to create these survival responses. It's in your body. So the body-based techniques are kind of like from the body up rather than from the head down. The body up techniques like grounding are really going to help. Step 6, mindfulness techniques. Very similar to grounding techniques, slight differences. Again, there's a lot of videos on them, but practicing some type of mindfulness every day while you wash the dishes, see if you can really focus on the feeling of the water, the soap. If it's warm water, probably feels good, rather than worrying about what else you have to do and rushing through it. And oh, your mind is over there and your body's here and you don't want to be here, right? That's how most of us do dishes or vacuum or a lot of these sort of basic tasks in life. See if you can be really present. I talk about this in the video I released last week, which gives more information about why the freeze response happens. But in that video, I talk about how when we align our bodies with our minds so that we are present here in this moment with what is actually happening right now, that's when we are happiest. And that's how we can become more and more emotionally regulated. Tool number 7 is to use your imagination to generate calm, peaceful feelings. So, the same way your imagined horrible things happening in the future are triggering an immediate chemical response in your body, when you imagine something nice and pleasant, you are triggering the opposite. So, sometimes people call this a safe place exercise. I find that that term really can trigger people. So, in the webinar that I have, which I'll tell you a little more about in a moment, but I talk about the beautiful place exercise. Just imagine being in a beautiful place. And if you really imagine it with all the bells and whistles, the sights, the sounds, the smells, everything about it, and you breathe it in, like really breathe it in, you will be releasing the chemicals that will help you calm down. And this is something to practice on a regular basis, not just in the middle of an amygdala hijack. In fact, I think it's probably impossible to use the imagination of a beautiful place in the middle of an amygdala hijack. But if you can even remember it, if you can even remember that there is such a thing, and remember that your body is responding with chemicals it does not need to a situation that doesn't warrant those chemicals. That, again, is bringing that prefrontal cortex online and can help you calm the whole situation. Now, the imagination technique, whether you use it with a beautiful place or being with people you love or remembering a good memory where you felt good about yourself, any one of those is good and practice them regularly. All right, so step 8 or tool 8 is to use this imagination to begin to rewire those associations. I'm going to explain this a little bit more in a moment, but I did want to tell you about the webinar I have, which actually walks you through that beautiful place exercise. And it also gives more information about how the brain gets wired to react and respond in these different ways. And it talks about the fact that our brains have enormous neuroplasticity. We can change our brain functioning. We can change what wires together and what doesn't wire together. And I think the webinar can give you a lot of ideas of how to change this as well as hope for change. So I'll put I'll show it here on the screen with a QR code, and the link will be in the description if you want to register. But using your imagination to rewire those associations, let me give you some examples. Let's say you have a very deeply embedded fear of authority figures from when you were a kid. Okay, not uncommon. So that now, when you are with your boss, you are having an overblown reaction to criticisms. And you go into a regular amygdala hijack in situations where there's any kind of work conflict. So you can use your imagination. And if you can do this with another person, wonderful, but you can also do it by yourself. Use your imagination to think through what you could say and then practice actually saying it. So you can imagine your boss upset with you saying something, and then you can verbalize the response you would like to have in that moment and see how much you can keep your body calm now, imagining that. So, what you're doing is you're giving your body and brain different experiences in connection to an association that you have an ingrained fear response to. Okay. I'm hoping this makes sense. I could go into a lot more detail on this, but I just want you to get the basic concept that your fear responses were ingrained in connection to certain situations, patterns, sometimes even sounds or smells, and reconditioning yourself, rewiring those associations by practice and by staying calm. This is actually part of exposure therapy, which, if someone can stick with it, can really help. But exposing yourself to that trigger situation in the imagination at first, if needed, right? So you can just imagine it. And before you do this work, when you imagine that situation, you'll be having all of those reactions. But over time, you'll be able to imagine it while staying calm right here, right now. And then you can also practice having a response. Just some final thoughts here. Self compassion, very, very helpful. Do your best. I know it's hard for a lot of people. It can be developed, but just as much as you can, stay away from criticizing yourself for having these responses. Know that they are normal. You're actually wired that way, and you're learning and you're trying. And then, of course, professional help can be super, super helpful, particularly if you have had a lot of stress or a lot of trauma in your life. A lot of what I talked about today is about rewiring your nervous system, your autonomic nervous system, and the connections it makes to situations that don't have to elicit that response. Let me know if this all made sense. Let me know if you have questions. Make sure you subscribe because next week I am coming out with a video on how all anxiety is actually an amygdala hijack. And maybe all is a little bit strong, but almost all, and all disorders, all disordered anxiety is a really an amygdala hijack. Okay, see you next week.